Welcome to Hungarians in the Kitchen. Today it's one Hungarian in the kitchen as I am going to show you how to make my gluten-free bread. First, and I'm going to talk about this bread, but we're going to go ahead and get started here. It's a yeasted bread, so you'll want to have 2.5 cups of water. And I already have this prepared, so it's around 110 degrees, which is a perfect temperature. You can have it go up to 115, but anything more than that, you're going to kill the yeast. And the yeast needs a little bit of sugar, and I use maple syrup, and I use just a little bit of it, not quite a tablespoon, maybe about half a tablespoon. And then you want to go ahead and have them become friends by whisking. And then we'll see that rise. The kind of yeast that I use that I really, really love is by a company called SAF, S-A-F. And so they're not the ones in the little packets, which I actually find sometimes work, sometimes don't work. But this always works, and I keep it in the freezer, and I keep it in a container like this, which I think I got from King Arthur. That's a great bread company. While that is rising, or while that is being activated, I like to use 5 different flours, and I do use 5 different flours, because if I don't use all of them, I have been told, Mama, this bread just isn't as good as it normally is. So the first one is sorghum flour. If you're not familiar with that, it's spelled S-O-R-G-H-U-M, and you can get that from the store. It's relatively inexpensive, and we start with a cup of that. I use a half cup measuring cup only because I'm going to be primarily, for the millet flour, I'm going to be just using a half a cup. So instead of using 1 cup and a half cup, less things to clean. And go ahead and use the brown rice flour, and again we have a cup of that. So this is great to do with children because they get to do a little math here. And as you can see, I'm not being very exact. I don't use a knife to make sure that it's exactly a cup. This is millet flour, and this is the one that we're going to only use a half cup. You can also get that at the store. And our last one is tapioca flour that we'll be using 1 cup of. And some people say that in some recipes that you can use arrowroot starch instead of tapioca. Again, I have found that when I do that, it just isn't the same. But you know, you can try it, and if you and your family like it, then by all means use it. But I do think that they behave differently when baked. The most expensive part, I think, in terms of the flour that we'll have is almond flour. This is about $10 per package or so in the store. But it's well worth it. It provides a little bit of protein. And we use 3/4 cup. And then the last thing we'll add to our dry mix is 1.5 teaspoons of salt. And I'm using a half a teaspoon measuring spoon. This is one of my favorite tools. Again, I bought that from King Arthur, and you can also get that from some kitchen specialty supply stores. It's for kneading bread or mixing bread dough and perhaps other batter. You could use a whisk at this point since it's not wet yet. So that's what we do while the yeast is being activated, and you might be able to see that it's nice and foamy at the top. And then we go ahead and add tablespoon of maple syrup. or 2 tablespoons of maple syrup. So that was 2 additional tablespoons of maple syrup because we had the original maple syrup when we were adding it with the yeast. This is 2 tablespoons of olive oil. And at this point, I like to use the whisk again. Okay, now this is the fantastic part and kind of the secret of making great gluten-free bread. And I got this idea from the wonderful folks over at Nourishing Meals up in the Northwest. They have great cookbooks out. So we add a 1/3 cup of ground flaxseed. I keep this in the refrigerator. I ground it myself using a little coffee grinder, and I keep it in the refrigerator, otherwise it goes rancid. So when you buy it, don't get the already ground. Get the seeds and grind it yourself if possible. And psyllium husk. Some people might know this as an ingredient in Metamucil. But it's a great kind of like a binder and a glue that holds everything together. So we're going to go ahead and add that in as well. And this is the part that you really need to pay attention and can't get into deep conversations on the phone with anyone, because you want this to sit for about 3 to 5 minutes, probably closer to 3 minutes. And what's going to happen is the flax and the psyllium husk are going to form into kind of a gelatinous substance. And that is what is going to allow the bread to really act as a glue, because you don't have the gluten in your flours. What I really like about this bread is that it's really dense but not so thick. Every time we bring it to a potluck, everyone is amazed that it's gluten-free bread. It's also more nutritious than some of the store-bought ones that you can find, which we were buying for a number of years until we found this recipe. The other thing that I really love about this bread is that you can you can knead it. And that's really important to me because I'm a Waldorf early childhood teacher, and I wanted to bring in a gluten-free bread that the children can knead as well as eat, and have it be really tasty and delicious. So I think that you'll really like this bread for a variety of reasons. As you can see, some of that already became gelatinous. So this is the part that, again, I wanted to make this video so you can kind of see how things combine. So one of the things that we'll want to make sure when combining this bread is that you don't give up in the middle of this process, because you're going to think it's not combining, it's just, you know, all dry and everything. But if you don't have one of these tools and you don't want to purchase one, I would just go ahead and use a wooden spoon, because it is kind of heavy, and if you were to use a whisk, all of the dough would just essentially stay in the middle of the whisk. So definitely use a heavy wooden spoon. If you were to put your hand in it right at this point before more of the flour is mixed in, most of the batter would be on your hands. I wouldn't recommend that. And as you are combining this, working it in, you'll notice at some point that it feels like it might even start breaking apart. So at this point, I put the tool aside and I start working it with my hands. And always bringing some of the flour from the bottom and working it into the dough. And as you push down on the dough itself, some of the more wet parts of the dough are revealed, which allows for the flour to continue to work into the dough. And as you can kind of see, a lot of the flour is still on the exterior part. So you want to continue to work that in, pressing down. If you're doing this with children, this is the point at which I would take it out of the bowl and give them each a little piece and a little bit of flour. But as you can see, it's really not sticking onto the hand anymore. If you are doing this with children and they are going to be adding in a bit of flour, I would probably reduce the amount of flour that you're using, perhaps the sorghum, perhaps the brown rice, between a quarter cup and a half a cup, maybe between the two, because they're going to be adding in quite a bit of flour as they're kneading. You don't want it to be too dense. Okay. Now, as I'm doing this, it's beginning to get a little sticky again. So this is the time when I put it into the sprayed, oiled, you can use whatever you would like. You can use butter. And I shape it into the bread pan. With some bread recipes, there's a couple of rises, a rise first in a large container, and then there's another one in the bread pan, but we're just going to do one in the bread pan, and it's going to rise for an hour. So what I like to do when I cover it, I used to use a tea towel, and you can certainly do that. Until this summer, we went and visited Maine, and we went to a place called Bessie's Country Store in Freeport, and it's off the beaten path. And we found these wonderful things. They're called bees wrap, and you can just go to Bessie's Country Store or beeswrap.com, and it's made with beeswax. And it keeps things just nice and snug. But this is one of my favorite things now to use. But again, you can also use a tea towel. And let this rise. Usually I put it right on my stovetop if I'm not cooking, but somewhere warm where there's no drafts. And set your timer for an hour. Usually about 40 minutes into it, I like to turn my oven on. You'll want to put this in a preheated oven set at 375, and you'll bake it for an hour. So we'll come back once we're ready to put it in the oven. Okay, so now this has been rising for an hour. Our timer just went off. I'm going to go ahead and remove the top. And as you can see, it has risen beautifully. You can see it kind of comes over the edges very nicely. And that's what it should look like. If it does not look like this, there's a pretty good chance that your yeast was not activated. So you want to really be mindful that your thermometer, that you're using your thermometer, and that it is between 110 and 115 degrees. The other thing that you'll see is pieces of the flaxseed. When I grind my flaxseed, I don't grind it completely to a very fine flour because I like the texture of the flaxseed. But that's kind of a personal decision that you'll just want to make and how you want your bread to look. And now it's ready to go into an oven, again at 375 degrees for an hour. Make sure you set your timer. So it's been an hour now, our timer's gone off, and it's ready to take out. So we'll put on our mittens. And leave them on, really, because we're going to have to turn it over. This can be a little tricky for some loaves. Sometimes I just kind of, on the sides, I try to press it out, and sometimes it's a little hesitant to come out. So when that happens, all I have to do is just simply, without cutting into the bread, just slip a bread butter knife into it, and then it should easily pop out. Just like that. Another thing I did not mention earlier about the benefits of making your own bread is the wonderful smell of bread. At Prairie Moon Waldorf School, where I work on Tuesdays when we make bread, it's just a wonderful treat as the parents come and pick up their children to smell fresh baked bread coming right out of the oven. So what we want to do at this point is allow it to cool for at least a half hour. I know that can be very difficult, but even 45 minutes to an hour is ideal. Otherwise, as you're cutting it, it will be still a little bit too soft to cut, and it'll kind of sort of fall apart on you. So we'll do that, and we'll come back and show you how beautiful the slices are. So now that the bread has cooled, we can touch it, and it's still nice and warm, but not too warm to cut. I wanted to talk about the weight of this bread. I had mentioned it earlier. So that's 2.5 pounds. That's easily twice the weight of any gluten-free bread that you would get in the store that's already made. But of course the proof is in the pudding, and we want to go ahead and test it. And I have some taste testers here who have been eagerly anticipating. Look how beautiful that is. We'll put some butter on. And this little taste tester here likes the end piece. And it's still warm to the touch, but not so much so that it falls apart. And this taste tester here likes the nice thick piece. But you can actually cut it fairly thin. We usually will get, depending on the thickness of the slice, up to 15, 16 slices if we slice them thin enough.
That's really good.
Yeah. So good luck in making your own gluten-free bread. It's really easy, and the more you practice, the more you're going to enjoy it and see the benefits of it in so many wonderful ways. And now I want to provide you with some additional information about the flours that we use. A lot of people often compare it to store-purchased gluten-free breads. And while initially it can be a sizable investment, I always get that response when people first go out and actually purchase the ingredients. You can get a number of loaves from the bags of flour. So it's not as if you're needing to purchase this for every single loaf that you're making. The other thing about store-purchased gluten-free breads is that you really need to look at the quality. This recipe is made with no egg, no corn, no dairy. And those are some sensitivities that more and more children in particular are having. And certainly it was the case in our family where we could not purchase gluten-free breads that had those ingredients in it. And then the other thing is texture. A lot of store-purchased gluten-free breads are crumbly, and really the only way that we were able to use them is by toasting it. So that's not the case here. In fact, we do toast it in the morning, but really it's great just fresh out of the oven. The next day we use them as sandwich breads. We use it for having it with our soups. You can also allow it to dry, toast it, and grind it into breadcrumbs. So you can really use a lot of it, and it goes a long way. So I wanted to talk about the millet flour. This is one that we purchased through Arrowhead Mills. But the great thing about it is that if you do have an electric grinder, grain grinder, I would recommend that you grind your own. You're going to get a lot more flour for your money that way. The same thing with the brown rice flour. We also use an electric grain grinder for that as well. Same thing with the flaxseed. You can use the coffee grinder to grind that. And again, I want to make sure that you're putting that into the refrigerator once it is ground and using it for next time. Then there's almond meal. As I had said, that is going to be your most expensive ingredient, and you can try reducing it to a half a cup. You're probably going to get about four to five loaves out of one of these packages. Sorghum flour is another inexpensive flour. I have not been able to find sorghum grains. Otherwise, I would grind that myself as well. The trickiest part in making this recipe when we were on vacation was finding the tapioca flour, tapioca starch. Bob's Red Mill makes one, but we were unable to find it. And so we had to go ahead and get another brand that we weren't familiar with. And it was a lot more expensive, and there was a lot less quantity. So if there's a way that you can source Bob's Red Mill, I would recommend purchasing it through there for it to be more cost effective for you.